Hi everybody, if you are watching this, then you are currently in e-time and we are going to be talking about plot vocabulary. So starting next week, we are going to be looking at the elements of plot as a whole class. However, this is your opportunity to see the words and get used to seeing the different vocabulary words that we will begin using very frequently next week. So what you need to do first is you need to go to Schoology. And you need to go to this week's folder, week of September 7th through the 10th. And you are going to go to today's folder, which is Wednesday, September 8th. When you get into Wednesday's folder, you will need to click on e-time, pre-teach plot vocabulary. And you will see an attachment. You will need to open that attachment. It should say plotvocabulary.pdf, and we will want to put that in Notability. So now you can go ahead and go to your Notability and open up that document that you just added. Okay, so like I said, we are going to be going through the different words associated with plot maps. At the very end of this video, you are going to be filling in some notes on your own. So for the first part of this video, all you need to do is watch and follow along. So we are going over plot vocabulary. When we talk about plot, plot is the events in a story. It's what happens in a story. So when we talk about plot, we're talking about what is actually happening in the story, what events are going on in the story. So the first part of plot is called the exposition. So the exposition of the plot occurs at the beginning of a story. Here the characters are introduced and we learn about the setting. Most importantly, we are introduced to the main conflict or problem. So there are a few key words here that we need to make note of. The exposition occurs at the beginning of a story. We also learn who the characters are, and we learn about what the setting is. We learn where and when the story took place. So on the plot map, the exposition happens at the very far left side. So over here we see the word exposition. It's over on the far left because it's the very first thing that happens in the plot of a story. It's the very first event. It's where we get all of our background information. So if you think back to the video we just watched, the For the Birds video, if we were trying to find the exposition of that video, we would need to think back to the very, very beginning of the video. What is the very first thing that happened? That would be our exposition. So in the video, our exposition is, it is a sunny morning and a bird lands on a telephone wire. The birds start to bicker and argue. So I learn my characters. I learn that the birds are my characters. And I learned my setting is a sunny morning on a telephone wire. And the current situation is that these little birds, they're starting to argue, they're starting to bicker and peck at each other. So that's our exposition. It's the beginning of the story where the characters are introduced and where we learn about the setting. Now we're going to move on to the inciting incident. So the inciting incident is the event that happens in the exposition that gets the story going. The inciting incident is also where we learn about the conflict. It's where we find out what is the conflict of the story. So this is called inciting incident. You'll see it called conflict sometimes. So I like to write conflict/inciting incident. Okay, and it's an event that happens in the exposition that gets the story going. This still happens really early on in the story. This is still close to the beginning of the story. On our plot map, you can see that it takes place here at this little angle, here at this intersection, because it gets us from our exposition to the next spot on our plot map. So our inciting incident happens at the little angle. So if we know the inciting incident is the event that happens in the exposition that gets the story going, if we know that that is where we learn what the conflict is, then in our short video for the birds, our inciting incident is when the little birds make fun of the bigger bird. So our exposition, remember, the birds all fly, they land on the wire, and now our inciting incident, this big bird flies up and the little birds start making fun of the bigger bird. Because of this, it gets the rest of the events in the story going. Next, we have rising action. So rising action is the part of the story, this part of the story, begins to develop the conflicts. This is a building of interest or suspense. So these pieces of rising action, this is usually a really interesting part of the story. It's still towards the beginning, it's right after the inciting incident, but this is where we start to see some heightened interest, some heightened suspense. So these events in the rising action will build suspense. So rising action occurs on the plot map on this left side going up. Remember, our plot map goes in order, so we started with our exposition, we moved to the inciting incident, and now we are here at the rising action. So the rising action is the part of the story that begins to develop the conflicts. This is a building of interest or suspense. We start to sit on the edge of our seat. We start to wonder what's going to happen. So in For the Birds, our rising action that's building suspense is when the big bird lands in between the small birds. All the small birds fall towards the big bird, and then the big bird slips, and the small birds start to peck his feet to make him fall off. So as the birds are pecking the feet, it's building suspense. We're wondering, oh my goodness, what is going to happen? So that is rising action, because it is developing the conflict, it is building interest or suspense. Our next vocabulary word is called the climax. The climax is also referred to as the turning point of a story. So the climax, this is the turning point of the story. This is usually when the main character comes face to face with a conflict. The main character will change in some way. It's also important to note that this is usually the most exciting part of the story. The climax is usually the most exciting part of the story. It's the biggest moment in the story. The climax happens at the top of our plot map because it is the most interesting part. Up to this point, everything has been leading us to the climax. We started with our exposition, we got to our inciting incident, all of our pieces of rising action were building suspense, and it finally got us to the climax, which is the most exciting part of the story. This is when our main character comes face to face with a problem. So in For the Birds, our climax, the most intense, exciting part of the story, was when the big bird's very last finger came off of the line. Up to that point, it was building suspense. The birds were starting to figure out, oh no, this isn't a good idea. And so in that moment, when the very last finger slips off of the telephone wire, that is our climax. That is the turning point. That is the most exciting part of the story, is when that little finger down there slips off and that big bird falls to the ground. So that is the climax or the turning point of a story. Next, we have falling action. So falling action, this is when our loose ends of the plot are tied up, our conflicts, our climax are getting taken care of. We are slowly but surely getting answers to our questions. Our falling action is later in the story. It's towards the end. It's after the climax. This is when it's not quite so intense. We're starting to get some of our conflicts and problems resolved. On our plot map, it's over here on the right side, after the climax. So if we know that the falling action is what happens after the climax, then in For the Birds, our falling action is when the little birds fall without their feathers. So our climax was whenever the big bird's last little finger slipped off the line, all the little birds flew up into the air, their feathers all came off, and then our falling action is when they all fall onto the ground and they don't have any feathers on them. That is our falling action. It happens after the climax. And finally, we have our resolution. So the resolution is when the story comes to a reasonable ending. It's how the story ends. It's the very last thing in the story that happens. On our plot map, it's all the way over here on the right because it's the very, very last thing that happens. And For the Birds, if we are looking for the resolution, we need to ask ourselves, what is the very last thing that happens? How does the story end? And in For the Birds, the little birds run and hide behind the big bird. That is how the story ends. That is the resolution of the story. So to review our plot map, remember, the most important thing you need to remember is that we start on the left. Our plot map goes in the same order of the story. So we start on the left with our exposition, our inciting incident, rising action, climax is at the top, falling action, and finally our resolution. Our plot map goes in the same order as the story, from left to right. So we are now going to fill in some terms on your notes page. So make sure that you are on the page that I am currently on. And we are going to fill in the blanks together. So remember, the exposition of the story occurs at the beginning of a story. Here, the characters are introduced and we learn about the setting. Most importantly, we are introduced to the main conflict or problem. So again, the exposition, it's the very first thing that happens. It occurs at the beginning of a short story. Here, the characters are introduced and we learn about the setting. Most importantly, we are introduced to the main conflict or problem. Next, we have the inciting incident. So the inciting incident is the event that happens in the exposition that gets the story going. Event that happens in the exposition that gets the story going. This is where we learn what is our big issue in the story. What event gets the ball rolling? Next, we have rising action. So the rising action is the part of the story that begins to develop the conflicts. It is a building of interest or suspense. So rising action, this part of the story begins to develop the conflicts. It is a building of interest or suspense. Next, we have the climax, or the turning point of the story. So this is the turning point of the story. This is the turning point of the story. Usually, the main character comes face to face with a conflict. The main character will change in some way. Okay, so for climax and turning point, this is the turning point of the story. Usually, the main character comes face to face with a conflict. The main character will change in some way. In our falling action, all loose ends of the plot are tied up. The conflicts and climax are taken care of. All loose ends of the plot are tied up. The conflicts and climax are taken care of. And finally, we have the resolution. This is the end of a story. It is when the story comes to a reasonable ending. The story comes to a reasonable ending. So I'm going to reread through these definitions so that you can be sure that your notes look like my notes. So, exposition occurs at the beginning of a story. Here the characters are introduced and we learn about the setting. Most importantly, we are introduced to the main conflict or problem. Inciting incident. Events that happen in the exposition that gets the story going. Rising action. This part of the story begins to develop the conflicts. A building of interest or suspense occurs. Climax or turning point. This is the turning point of the story. Usually, the main character comes face to face with a conflict. The main character will change in some way. Falling action. All loose ends of the plot are tied up. The conflicts and climax are taken care of. Resolution. The story comes to a reasonable ending. So you should now have all of those definitions. Finally, we're going to look at this very last image here that says putting it all together. So the most important thing right now that you need to know is that the plot map, all these words, they go in order. So we have our exposition is number 1. That's our first thing that happens. Along with our exposition is our inciting incident. And our rising action. Our exposition, our inciting incident, our rising action happen in the beginning of the story. We then move on to the climax, which happens in the middle of the story. Finally, we move on to the falling action and the resolution, which happens at the end of this story. So again, all of these words, they go in order. They go in the same order as the book. So we are going to practice this a whole lot in class and maybe in some more e-times. For right now, it's just important that you have at least a little bit of an understanding of what these words mean. If you don't fully understand everything, that's okay. We'll have a lot more practice. But for right now, you at least have these notes that you can refer back to at any point in time.